Evening, everyone. How you doing? So I'm not sure I've met everyone here, but I've been part of CFC predominantly in South Belfast for the past 10 years. I came to faith here about 10 years ago. And one of the favourite things about my job in Crown Jesus is that you get to be part of the church all across the island, and you get to meet with church communities all over, and you actually get such a beautiful bird's eye view of like the diversity of expressions of worship that occur here, and it's absolutely beautiful. But it's also just really nice doing something at home with my home church. So this is brilliant, and it just feels really good. So thanks for having us tonight. We're going to look at this theme of story. Ultimately, how we can effectively share our story in order to bless other people. But for the first 10 minutes here, let's think a wee bit about this idea of story in general. If you think of story, it's ultimately any story is a series of events, right? It's a series of events which occur and that are connected and related to each other. Each event is related to one another, affecting the other in some way or other. And over the course of a life, the story of a life is a series of incredibly interconnected events that are happening in ways that are so complex we can't actually fully understand. Human life is a story. And everyone we meet, regardless for how long, will be in some stage of their own story in life. And I think I could say for all of us here on a daily basis, our stories are going to collide with other people's stories in a way which forms us in some way. About a few months ago, I was in Slovakia. I was there with a few friends. It wasn't a mission trip. We were just there. We were there for the banter. And we were on our way to the airport home. And it was a late night flight. It was Ryanair, so of course the flight was delayed. And we were all quite tired. We were sitting in separate seats. We're too cheap to pay for seats together. So honestly, like I was just wanting to get home. Do you know when you're tired and you can't be bothered with a flight? So I got on the plane. I think it was about an hour delayed. Sat down, immediately just put the headphones in, put the head down. In other words, you're giving the message, I don't want to talk to anyone. Like, don't engage with me. And about half an hour into the flight, there was a girl sitting beside me with a Ryanair uniform on. So she was obviously transferring to a different airport in order to work on another flight. About half an hour into the flight, another flight attendant comes up to her, and I hear them say, would you mind moving to the back of the plane? So that's interesting. So she got up and she moved to the back of the plane. And then about 2 minutes later, this big lad, this tank, comes down and plonks himself right beside me. And immediately I can smell the alcohol. And he turns to me and he says, I was just asked to leave the back of the plane because I was starting fights. Right? So I'm like, why on earth would you put him beside me? Like they didn't ask my permission. Like honestly, it's not good. It's not good practice. So even more so, I was like, don't look up. Like I was laser focused on the front of the seat, and he kept on talking to me. He kept on talking to me, and he was going through rotations of emotions. So 1 second he was incredibly angry. The next second he was nearly in tears. And then the next second he was laughing, and I kept on going in this rotation. After a while, I kind of asked, like, God, have you done this for a reason? Do you know when you just have that impression sometimes? So I took out one headphone, and he was telling me about his alcoholism. I hadn't said a word to him. He was telling me about his alcoholism. And he was speaking really loud. So I think probably 4 rows in front and 4 rows behind me was dead silent listening to this exchange, right? So I asked him, you know, have you ever sought help to deal with your addiction? And he said to me, I went to AA, but I couldn't find the higher power. And I was like, right, so God obviously has done this on purpose. So for the next half an hour until the plane landed, we had this chat about his story. And he was telling me that he'd been an alcoholic. He was 33, same age as me. He was an alcoholic from the time he was early teens. He didn't think his father loved him. And honestly, it was amazing. All he wanted was an embrace from his father. He wanted a hug from his dad, honestly. His mum was a Christian. And what he continually was saying to me was, I really want to believe. I really want to believe in Jesus, but I can't find it in myself to believe it's true. I need God to show that he's real. Right, over and over again. And, towards the end, I was kind of praying, like, God, give me a chance to pray. But this guy, he asks me for prayer towards the end of the flight. And, I did what I can to kind of share Jesus with this guy and kind of relate to him. He didn't come to faith in the plane, but, I believe that exchange happened for a reason. It formed me, and I really believe it will have formed him in some way as well. So our stories are going to collide with others, like sometimes in really random, unexpected environments. I'm sure we all have some testimonies like that. And that kind of exchange, it really reminded me of, I think it was like symptomatic of society in general. It reminds me of Romans 6. It talks about like the wages of sin, this idea that there is a consequence to the path of life that we're on, that everyone's story is on a trajectory. Stories go in a certain direction. And without the hope of Christ, the trajectory of people's lives is always going to be one towards death and darkness. And it doesn't matter how much we try to find redemption in ourselves, it simply won't come until Jesus steps in to intervene in that story and provide a different story that will transform our identity and our destiny. And whether it's individual or corporate, everything has a trajectory and a direction. It's not just individuals that have a story, but a society. But it's not just society. God, of course, has a story too. The gospel is God's story of his rule and his reign, of God revealing himself to creation. It's a story of his redemption. It's a story that culminates, has its climax in Jesus Christ. The death, resurrection, and ascension of our Savior. It's his story of restoration. So the gospel changes our story as well. And evangelism in general, before we narrow down into this idea of story, like what an honor we have as the church to communicate with the power of the Spirit, God's story, to do whatever we can to ensure that people would have a revelation of Jesus Christ as King, a revelation of his goodness, a revelation of his mercy and his lordship and his compassion and his love. We get to echo the call of Jesus, come to him, all who are thirsty, and he will give you everlasting life. So as those who have come to Jesus, we have a story. We have a story of how the redemptive work of Jesus Christ has changed the trajectory of our life. At one point, I was going this direction until Jesus steps right in the power of his Spirit and sets me on a completely new path that is inherently good and full of hope. He has changed the trajectory of all of our lives in a seismic way. So making that specific, right, to that idea of sharing our stories, here's the question for tonight. How can we communicate our story of finding redemption in a way which glorifies God's story of providing redemption in a way which transforms their story with the hope of redemption? That's the task at hand, right? So I'm going to hand over to Amanda, and she'll give us a grounding for why stories are important.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, my name's Amanda, for those of you who haven't met yet, and I normally attend CFC East here. I've been part of the church for, goodness, nearly 10 years now. So again, as Tim said, a privilege to be sharing with you guys tonight. We all know that we have been commissioned to tell the story of the gospel. But as Christians, we often struggle with what that looks like and how we can find a space and a way to do it that really fits who we are and our identity. And I think that, first of all, before we kind of go into a section of thinking about some really practical ways to do that, I think it's really good to understand the importance of why we should tell the story that we're living out and what the Bible has to say about that. So in this short section, I just want to have a look. Let's open our Bibles and have a look at what the Bible actually says. And I want to use two different passages. So we're going to start off in Romans 10. So if you have that at hand, and I'll read it out to you if you don't. Romans 10, verses 14 to 15 says this: "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news." What Paul is doing here in the midst of a wider passage and which focuses in on the need for communicating the truth of what the hearers were, what they actually believed. He's emphasizing this need of communication, of how we communicate the good news, which is so important to us. You know, how will anyone ever get to the point of placing their trust in Jesus if they don't know who he is or what he's done? How will they ever know who he is and what he's done unless someone tells them about it? That's what Paul's communicating here. What he's saying is that good news, something that transforms and makes such a difference, is worthy of being shared. Good news is something that we communicate. I don't know about you, but I love a good story. I love it whenever I catch up with somebody and the first thing they say is, "Wait till you hear? Wait till you hear what happened? Let me tell you what happened to me today." Because there's something that's like, right, I'm in this with you. I want to know what it is that you've got to communicate. And what Paul's doing here is he's showing and he's demonstrating that when we have something which is good news, that communication is key. It's not something that we hold to ourselves. And Paul here is quoting from Isaiah 52, verse 7, when he says, "How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news." And you know, I'm really glad that he added this bit in, because when you first read that passage, some of the words in it are quite daunting. Things like, you know, preaching and being sent. And I think sometimes as Christians, we get caught up in this idea of like communicating the gospel is about preaching, or it's being called or being sent into an environment. But actually, Paul brings this together and says, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. And when you go into the original language of that in the Hebrew, when you go back to Isaiah, that word to bring is this word bizarre. And actually what it conveys is so much more than just bringing something, but it's about carrying something with you into the spaces that you go. It's about something that's part of who you are and you're bringing it to others. It also conveys this, you know, when you think of a herald, somebody who comes into a town and makes this declaration of something that needs to be communicated to other people. So there's this emphasis of, yes, I carry something, but I also proclaim something. I speak something out into the space in front of me. It's about telling, about publishing, about conveying something that has truth to it. But not only does bizarre convey these kind of notions of communication, they also imply how. So there's this emphasis behind it, like that the language speaks of something that's really fresh and life-giving. It speaks of fullness. It speaks of a rosiness, like a life and a colour to it, a cheerfulness, and being able to communicate a message. And that's what happens, isn't it? When somebody tells you good news, it's not just what they say, but it's how they say it. There's something about their body language. There's something about how they behave. There's something about their communication skills, not just verbally, but as a person that says something bigger than just the words that are being communicated. And that's what it means to bring good news, because the good news is not just something that we know in our heads and words that we communicate with our mouth, but it's a story of how Jesus Christ has completely transformed our lives. And so the lives that we live out in front of other people tell a story. It's not just about the words, but it's how we live. Each one of us has a good news story to tell, a story of how a life has been transformed. But not only that, it's not just good news for me because my life's been transformed, but it's good news for you because you can also have access to this good news. I mean, I could say, wait to hear what happened to me on the way home. And I'm walking and I'm telling this story and I find this money and there's £100 at the side of the road. And you would be like, Amanda, that's amazing. Congratulations, you've got £100. Good news to me. Not much good news for the person I'm telling, but they celebrate with me because that's good news. But for me to be able to communicate, like actually every time you walk down that road, there's £100. Every time you go down that road, there will be £100. How many people are going to be walking down that road because they want this? So the good news is not just something that's transformed me, but something that's accessible to all. Secondly, whenever we share our faith and tell our story, we're not just telling them that we're a Christian and that we have a faith or a belief system that we hold on to, but what we're doing is we're making this declaration of faith about who God is and the power that he has to change and impact lives, situations, and communities. The second passage that I want to touch on, which shows us this, is in Revelation 12 and verse 11. And right in the middle of this unusual chapter in the book of Revelation, where the writing is referencing this great conflict between God and the forces of evil, there's this beautiful hymn that celebrates the victory over Satan. And verse 11 says this, he says, "They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony." You see, it reminds us as Christians that we have victory over Satan and the forces of evil. That our victory is one that is final and eternal. It is one that we stand in because of everything that Jesus has done. It tells us that we have this victory for two reasons. One, on account of the blood of the Lamb, that's the real basis for all victory that we live in our life. It's always the cross. But secondly, that comes in partnership with our testimony, our declaration of what Jesus has done. Jesus died on the cross. He redeemed us and he gave us new life. He conquered sin and death once and for all. And that's a once in a lifetime thing that happened. But the implication of that in our lives means that we get to live out that good news. And not just that it impacts our lives, but that it can impact others. And I think it's always a good reminder that we have a testimony because of what Jesus accomplished in his death and resurrection. And so we have to always remember that our story is a story where Jesus' story has impacted our story. But the reality is that we are living out our stories in a broken world, a place where evil reigns until Jesus returns. And so we live in desperate situations with people who are walking very difficult circumstances, and we also are experiencing that in our own lives. But Satan's mission, one of the things that we see in this chapter in Revelation, is that Satan's mission is to try and do the most damage that he can do until Jesus comes back. He wants to prevent as many people from knowing Jesus as their Lord and Savior. And he also wants to distract us Christians from being wholehearted in our following of him and to render us effective in any way possible. But what our testimony does whenever we speak out the truth of what Jesus has done in our lives is it bears witness, it provides evidence, it communicates truth, and it provides a record of what Jesus has done. And so when we share our testimony, when we share our stories with the people that we do life with, it's pointing to a better way. It's pointing to an eternal hope. It's pointing to the truth of who Jesus is and the hope that we can have in him. And not only does it point towards him, but it also raises hope and expectation for others. Because if Jesus can do it for me, then he can do it for you. That's what our story communicates. You know, when we are able to tell the story of where we've seen healing in our lives, what we're saying to people who are sick is that we have a healer, a God who is a healer, who can bring healing into your life. Let me introduce him to you. Our story declares that even in the midst of financial hardship, that Jesus and God is our provider, that even in the midst of loss and desperate circumstances, that God is our comforter. Our stories communicate that even in the midst of chaos and like looking out into culture and seeing everything that just seems to be kind of going in a certain direction, that God gives us peace that surpasses all understanding. Our story communicates that even in the midst of death, we can find life in Him. In the midst of sorrow, that it's possible to experience joy. And in the midst of need, that our God will always be enough. That's what our story communicates. And so if He does it for me, why not you? And so I think very often when we think of communicating our stories or thinking of evangelism or thinking of being called to go out and make disciples, words like preaching and testimony, like we've seen in these passages, automatically I think when we hear that sometimes we discount ourselves and we say, that's not for me. Like I'm not called to be a preacher. I'm not called to stand at the front and give my testimony or to tell my story. I just can't do that. But what the reality is of what's being communicated through these passages is we're all called to communicate, and we all can communicate. We all do it very well on a daily basis. Yes, there's a place for preaching. Yes, there's a place for sharing testimony at the front. But when we get to do life one-to-one with people, we communicate all the time. And so the story of who we are and what God has done in our life is a great opportunity for us to be able to share that through our lives with others. And so why do we use this language of storytelling? I mean, storytelling is not a new phenomenon. This is something that goes right back into the beginning of time as we know it. Stories have always been used to communicate something. Information, facts, events were passed on from generation to generation before people could even write. Storytelling was the key way of helping the people to grasp hold of a truth, grasp hold of an event, and to remember it and to communicate it. And stories were told over and over and over again, and people held them in their heads and held them in their hearts, and they were passed right through like generation to generation to generation. And it's easy. Why? Because it's easy. It's easy for people to remember. It's easy for people to repeat. And some examples of why stories are a really good way to communicate are this. First of all, stories enable us to be able to tell facts in a way that helps people to grasp hold of them. I don't know about you and what kind of learner you are, but whenever you're in school and you just have a teacher, we had an RE teacher who literally just gave us a book, and she had a book and she read out like the words on the page, and we just had to write them down word for word in our book, and that was it. Like it was going in one ear and out the other. It literally got to my hand onto the page and I forgot about it. But when you have somebody who can communicate stories and be able to communicate truth in a way that captures your imagination, there's something about that sticks inside of you. And who was the master storyteller but Jesus himself? I mean, we just have to open the New Testament and read about the way that Jesus communicated, and we see a variety of ways. Yes, he preached. Yes, he stood on a mountainside and spoke to multiples, but he also spoke to people one-to-one, and he conveyed stories to crowds through truth to crowds through stories. That's what parables are. Jesus conveying facts of the kingdom through a personal story that relates to the circumstances that people find themselves in. And that's what we are. We are stories that communicate a truth about a God, and people see it lived out in our lives. You know, what better way than to communicate a truth and being able to say, let me tell you about how that played out in my life. Let me tell you about a time when I was. Let me tell you about an opportunity that I had too, and people relate to that. Secondly, stories make connections with not just people's heads, but their hearts. People connect to people. People connect to other people's stories, and there's something about hearing a story and being able to put yourself in that story that helps it to stick. Like, I know whenever somebody comes to me, that whole, like, let me tell you, you listen to the story and you can almost put yourself in their shoes, can't you? You can imagine what it would be like. And as they're conveying the story, you're like, oh my word, and I think I would have done it like this, or what would you have done? And this whole conversation comes because even though you weren't there, you feel like you're in the midst of it. You can almost smell the area. You can hear the words. You can hear the noises. You can feel the emotions that somebody else is conveying, even though you aren't there. There's this connection in storytelling that helps us to relate to people in a way that just reading facts on a page doesn't. But stories also make truth accessible. People can argue all day long over whether something's black or white, or whether something adds up the way it is, or whether something's scientific or not. But people can't argue with our experience. It's something that's so personal and so raw to us. You see, the reality is that each one of us are living evidence of the power of Jesus. That each one of us communicates the truth of what Jesus has done on the cross and the transforming power that brings. Our story isn't just what we tell people verbally, but actually how we live our lives out and how we walk through life communicates something of the truth that we believe. People should look at our lives and see something different in us. People should see the fruit of the Spirit working itself out. People should see us handling circumstances differently. People should see the joy in us and the peace in us that can only come from God as we live out our lives and our circumstances. And even without using words, people should see something in us that stands for something different. When the Bible talks about the fruit of the Spirit, we should be living evidence of that. When the Bible talks about the power of prayer, we should be living evidence of that. Our lives should be able to bear testimony to the truth that we find in the Bible. And so where the Bible itself may be quite inaccessible to somebody who would never read it, who would never pick it up, there should be something about our lives that point towards that truth. And finally, as Tim's already said, there's something about our story which connects to God's story, because our story is part of God's story. You see, the overarching story of the Bible is about how God comes close to us, that God interrupts us in our everyday ordinariness, and he gives us a better opportunity. He gives us a better option to the life that we live. And so when we share our story, we're not just telling a story about who we are, but we're telling a story about who God is. And that doesn't always have to be as obvious as sitting down and being like, let me tell you about, and walking people through Scripture. But as we build relationships with people, as we have conversations, as we allow them glimpses into our lives, as we strip back and allow some vulnerability at times, people can see something in us that points to something different. And so a good testimony will always have Jesus at the core of it, the gospel, the fact that God's story is about him coming to earth, becoming man and living amongst us, dying for our sin, rising again and being seated at the right hand of the Father, and giving us his Holy Spirit to empower us to live a better way. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a moment to pause and to think. In this first section, we've just been talking a little bit about what story is and thinking about what the Bible has to say. So what I want you to do, you've sort of like 5 to 8 minutes in 2s and 3s where you are, have a conversation, right? First of all, 2 questions. First thing is, what did you think whenever you were coming here tonight about what it meant to communicate your story? And secondly, how has some of what we've unpacked already started to change your thoughts on that? So have a bit of a chat and then we'll be back in a few minutes.
Okay. So sorry for cutting your chat short. We are going to leave some time at the end because we'd love to hear any reflections that you guys have or like a bit of a Q&A. So please retain anything you'd like to share for the group as well. It'll be great. But now we're going to get kind of practical. We have six tips or hopefully helpful pointers to help all of us share our stories. We're going to tag team it. So I'll kick off with it. So here's the first thing that we can all do to help us share our story is simply to be prepared, right? recently I've been kind of finding, and I'm not saying this is like a spiritual rule or anything, but recently I've been finding the more prepared I am to have a conversation and to share my story, the more frequently God will provide opportunities for that conversation to happen. And I don't know what's been happening recently, but God's been kind of like humbling me, or maybe taking away a bit of the fear of man, where it's just like, into any environment, I think we can have a conversation about faith in any environment. In any environment with wisdom, I think we can have a conversation about a story of following Jesus. So we need to be prepared for when that time comes. I'm not suggesting that a personal testimony needs to be scripted. Not at all. You know, that it wouldn't be authentic if we were to simply have a set 200-word script that we could rhyme off. It wouldn't be feasible either. You know, unless we're sharing our testimony at a specific event, which is absolutely like a common thing that happens, of course, but unless we're doing that with an allocated time, you know, a lot of the time we're just going to be given brief glimpses of our testimony. And the parts of our testimony that we share will be dependent on the environment that we're in, and the person that we're talking to, and the kind of conversation we're having, of course. And oftentimes, actually, I think sharing parts of our testimony, it often goes alongside other forms of evangelism. So I think it's quite common, actually, you know, if I'm talking to someone about like maybe an apologetics related question, you know, maybe someone's wrestling with this idea of like, is it actually rational to believe in the existence of a deity at all? Very often a conversation like that will then lead into, well, can I share like my experience? This is why I believe in God. Here's been my experience of encountering God in my own life. I've found a new hobby recently, which is karaoke. Believe it or not, like, I am not the kind of guy that like you would guess likes karaoke at all. So with that in mind, no. So, right, just as an example of just how unexpected God can be with this when we're prepared, I was in a karaoke joint recently, and with a group of friends, and my best friend, Chris, none of my friends from uni are Christians. I was the only Christian. My best friend, Chris, I think he was singing, do you know Alone by Heart? But one of the best songs ever written, Alone by Heart, an absolute power ballad. And I'm sitting there, and I just, through no effort of my own, I find myself having a conversation with his mate about reasons for the existence of God. I say, what's going on here? And he is not the kind of guy that you would have necessarily expected to be a seeker. Initially, he was actually quite bluntly against the idea, but he brought it up with me. And we ended up having this incredible conversation. It turns out he is deeply searching. And that's one thing I think we find as well. Often the people who are most against it are the ones who are most hungry for something authentic. An authentic experience of God and spirituality. We need to get past that veneer and actually be willing to dig deep with people. And we had this incredible apologetics-related conversation about why he doesn't believe in God but really wants to, and why I do believe in God, which linked into my personal testimony of me trying to communicate to him in my past how I've found so much peace through knowing Jesus Christ, and how it's brought me peace in the midst of dark times in a karaoke bar while Chris is singing Alone by Heart, right? And I love that. I love that God is just so open to the gospel being shared on every sphere of culture here. And like the gospel message itself, you know, it's the better we know the gospel, the more articulately and simply we'll be able to communicate it. The better we know our own story, which isn't a given because we have to process our own pasts, right? The better we know our own story, then the more wise we'll be about knowing what to share and how to share it and when to share it. So we have a, is it an acronym? So we have an acronym that we use. It's your best story. So I'm not suggesting that anytime we get an opportunity, we recycle the acronym. Okay, so B, before. Let me tell you about before coming to Christ. No, but I think this is just four things that we can have in mind in forming our story in our own minds. Four things that are very important to come to terms with. The first is be before. We need to be able to understand and process our own past, and to be able to convey that in a way which other people can connect with. Ultimately, I think knowing our past it enables us to have empathy for people that don't know Jesus. And it's not something that I think a lot about, actually, but can you remember, and maybe some of us can't, and that's okay, but can you remember a time in your life when you did not have the hope of the gospel? So I can. Just 10 years ago. It's not that long ago for me, but I get that other people might not. But can we have an empathy with people who don't have the hope of the gospel? Do you remember what it's like to not have this knowledge that I have true hope in my future? Do you remember what it's like to not have this rock solid sense of the presence of God in me, with me, his approval, no condemnation, his infinite love for me, this ability to pray? Can we remember back to a time when none of that was there? Empathize with people who are going through life from a similar position. A time when we couldn't trust God with everything. So in being able to remember that, in being able to articulate that to people, it enables us to get in the same level as others who haven't had the same experiences of God since. Anytime, for me personally, because all I can do is relate this personally to myself, it's about personal stories, right? Anytime I meet people who are experiencing a sense of hopelessness or loneliness, something kind of switches on me where I remember how much I struggled with that before coming to Christ, and I'm able to empathize and relate to where they're at. And it's in this sharing of life before Christ that I can make a contrast, but let me tell you how that has been remedied in my life since coming to know Jesus Christ. We have to confront the darkness before we're able to share the light. And I think also, being able to empathize with people and where they're at in a mindset of not knowing Jesus, it helps us in our evangelism because it helps us to reflect, how might someone react or digest the gospel when they're coming from all these different perspectives? So maybe some of us in here were proactively hostile to Christianity before coming to faith. Well, then you're able to relate to people you're talking to who are hostile, because you know the emotions, you know the reasons behind that. You can understand the frustrations with church culture, maybe. Maybe you've went through a real season of doubt in your Christian walk. You're able to empathize with people who are experiencing doubt and questioning of what they believe to be true. Maybe it's a season of hurt from the church, of which there's plenty on this island. Plenty on this island. I've had conversations about that in the past week. If you've been hurt by church, and actually part of your testimony is empathizing with people who've been through that. Then moving on quickly, we have E, evangelization. What do we mean by that? It's the process of you considering and coming to Christ. Again, can you remember that season in life where you began to hear the call of Jesus? You began to discern the work of the Spirit in your life, whatever language you use. This helps us to relate. And it helps other people to relate to us as well. So in sharing about our process of hearing God's call, whatever that looked like for you, we can help others relate to what we're saying, because everyone is approaching this from different positions. Church background, non-church background, atheistic background, whatever their worldview or ideology is, everyone is coming at this from a different direction. But I think everyone would be able to relate, because, it's amazing how many people are actually curious about Jesus. It is amazing. The past week, our team's been on the road having loads of conversations about Jesus across the island. And for me personally, it blew me away just how many people I would simply stop and give a Gospel of John to in order to start a conversation. It amazed me just how many people were curious, at the very least, about Jesus Christ and were willing to actually engage in a conversation, you know. I remember, in my testimony, in this journey of evangelization, I came to faith in CFC, but it's not like I just came through the doors on the back of a whim. I was working in a charity. I was one of those guys that stopped people on the street that everyone hates. I was one of those people. And there was 2 girls who worked in that charity. And one of them carried this little notebook around where she wrote down words from God and prayers and stuff about Jesus. The other girl was just radiant with the Holy Spirit that I had never seen before. Now, I've never actually told them this, but they are instrumental in my journey of coming to faith. They came to CFC. They are the reason why I came through the doors into this auditorium. Another part of my evangelization, at one stage there was a young adults prophetic prayer night, and there was tables set out on this stage. Again, I was in that process of searching, but I came up for prayer, I sat down, and it was Tanya and Grace. And they prayed for me. I've still got the recording on my phone. They prayed for me, and the words they spoke over me spoke into my past in a crazy way, spoke into my insecurities. And I left that table a huge step closer to having a revelation of Jesus Christ as my King. They were a part of my journey. So in sharing your journey of evangelization, it encourages others to take the same steps too. Then S, salvation. Ultimately, in any conversation, we have the chance to glorify the work of Jesus in our lives. That all eyes will actually be pointed to him. That we have this opportunity here just to give him praise and worship in any conversation. So in sharing about that moment or season when you give your life to Jesus, it's a brilliant chance to provide someone with a deeper understanding of the gospel. Because there's a lot of misconceptions about what the gospel message actually is. A lot of people think the gospel is that God wants to turn us from bad people into good people. A lot of people's perception of the gospel is that it's behavioral modification. But in sharing my story, the emphasis isn't that I was a bad person, although I think I probably was, and now I'm slightly less bad. The emphasis on my story is that I was once dead. I was dead inside. I was spiritually dead. And Jesus has made me alive. And I know it, I feel it. I'm alive in the Spirit because of what Jesus has done for me. We have this chance to glorify God in the midst of our testimony. Your salvation doesn't have to be this one specific dramatic moment either. Sometimes we feel like our stories need to be exciting, or that we need to kind of jazz them up, or feel pressured that our story isn't as good as someone else's or whatever. I don't have that salvation moment. In my life, it was like this gradual process of meeting those 2 girls, of coming here, receiving prayer. I remember one of the first few months I came here is when Andy McCourt was pastor here. And the way Andy would preach with a boldness, with like this belief that God was actually powerful, that he was infinitely powerful, that he was a glorious God, and that God was capable of actually doing things right here, right now, in transforming lives. Again, that was a huge step, but it was a gradual process of like my turning from this to this. So what does your salvation moment look like? It doesn't have to be the big dramatic moment, because we don't all have one of those maybe. And then finally, transformation. So in having a chat with people, we have this chance to envision someone as to why following Jesus is a compelling way of life. Sometimes testimonies focus exclusively on, in my past I did this and this and this and this, then I met Jesus. Done. But I'm like, it's not just about communicating what we've been saved from. We need to communicate a compelling vision of why someone would want to give their life to him. A lifelong discipleship journey. What are we saved for? Are we able to articulate like how God is at work in our present? How he's giving us hope for the future? Like the giftings that he's given us, the passions that he's given us, the doors that he's opening? Are we radiant in the same way that girl was radiant that pointed me to Jesus as well? I think sometimes it's just about, learning for the personal testimony, not just to be an abstract event that we do, but more so that it just becomes part of our DNA. And I think that comes over time with willingness and practice and being prepared. The idea that like in any conversation, it would be natural for us to share something of the most important part of our life. So over to you, man.
Thanks. The second thing that we want to convey is about the importance of being yourself. And for me, whenever I first became a Christian, I really struggled to tell anybody that I was a Christian. You see, I grew up over my teenage years, really struggling with my identity, really struggling with my self-worth, and always was worried or concerned about what other people thought of me. And so when it came to becoming a Christian and making that decision, even to the people who were constantly, sharing their faith with me and people who I knew were Christians, I still found it really difficult just to say, I've become a Christian. Because there was a fear that stopped me from being able to communicate this incredible good news. And I think that fear comes from the identity that I had of myself, of not really understanding who I was. And a huge part of my testimony and my journey with God, and still even to this day, is as how God has revealed to me who I am in him, and finding the confidence to be fully that person in him. And I think it's really easy in any sphere of life to look at what other people have and wish that we had it. And whether that is how we look, or the jobs that we have, or the places that we work, or just in doing life, it always feels like the grass is greener, doesn't it? It always feels like somebody else has just got a wee bit of a better deal than us. And I think that there is something inside of us, even as Christians, that holds on to that a little bit. That we look at other people's stories, we look at other people's Christian walk, and we think, they've got it better than me, or their story's more interesting than mine. Why would people want to know my story? Like, what I've been through isn't really relevant. And I think as well, there's such a power in being able to communicate who you are. And I think, and I truly believe that actually a big part of what we see in culture now, and this wrestle for identity, that the attack is on identity, because Satan knows that when we step into the fullness of who we are in Christ, that we are forces to be reckoned with. And so actually telling our story and being able to communicate a bit about who we are in him has great power. And your story is as valuable as the next. Your story carries as much worth as the next person. I remember, it must have been about 15, maybe 18 years ago, a local author, Christian author, was writing a book on testimonies. And he wanted to include 5 testimonies in it. He had 4, and he spent a long time trying to find the 5th one. He had a guy who played rugby for Ulster, who was a Christian, and his story. He had another guy who was a Christian who had been in a terrible accident and who was paralysed from the neck down, or from the waist down, and played wheelchair rugby for Ireland. He had another girl who had this incredible story of transformation and starting this business and the impact that she had in Africa. And then another girl who had been part of this TV thing that, just was she was really visible. And for some reason, he came to me and was like, I've heard you have a story and I'd love to be able to share it in my book. And I was kind of like, okay, I don't really know what it is you're going to write about. Like, I mean, if you, literally I'm thinking, does he have 5 pages left that he needs to fill? Because there's nothing to say. And as I went through that process of communicating my story and actually doing what Tim just said, like actually going right back and thinking about all the parts that were involved in it and how I wanted to communicate that and how I wanted him to communicate that on my behalf, something that was written down on paper for everybody to see, was a really vulnerable and soul-searching process. And I remember that when the book was launched, the whole way through it, I just kept thinking, God, what are you doing? Like, this just does not make sense. There's nothing, like if I was reading this book, I would skip past my story. Like, it's not even interesting. And on the book launch night, which was just across the road in Park Avenue at the time, we all had a few minutes to share a little bit of our story, almost to whet people's appetite, that they would go, oh, that's great, I want to read more about that. And I was dreading it because I was just like, what on earth am I going to say? What am I going to share that's going to be that thing that people will go, I want to read her story? And the main emphasis of what he was trying to bring out of my story was just about the role that I had I worked in the fashion industry at the time, and just the favour that I had found in that space to be able to progress very quickly to very senior roles, and the culture that I had created in my own workplace that had seen people come to faith. So it was kind of that story about how I lived out my faith in the workplace and in business. And everybody shared their stories, including me. And then at the end, people were wanting people to sign the books and all the rest of it. And this girl came up to me, and I've never forgotten this moment. And she said to me, like, thank you so much for your story. Because I was really in awe listening to everybody else's stories. And I was like, wow, isn't that incredible what they've done? Isn't that incredible the experiences they've had? But when you told your story, it hit me in the gut, because I just realized that God can do extraordinary things through really ordinary people. And it blew me away, because I never felt that my story was extraordinary. But actually, when our stories connect with God's story, it is extraordinary. And so the value of us being truly ourselves, of being authentic in who we are, in communicating the truth about who we are, and in being prepared to be a little bit vulnerable and being wise in how vulnerable we are at different moments. There's something in that demonstrates to others that their story is also valuable, that their story does have worth, and that God can come into their story and make a difference. That he doesn't just want to pursue this, we hear so often in churches, these incredible transformation stories of people who were in the gutter, people who were addicted, people who had these massive transformation moments where it's like a complete 180-degree turn. And we think those are the kind of stories that really matter, because it's really obvious. But not everybody has a story like that. And so where that story will connect with a certain type of person, my story will connect with others. And there are people out there that need to hear your story, because your story is the story that will connect with them, because you can connect with them. There's people who you will come into contact with in your life that nobody else will have the opportunity to share a story with. There'll be people who you do life with on a regular basis, and you might think it doesn't really matter that much. Somebody else will be able to share, but maybe there is nobody else to share. And so as you do life with people, don't discount yourself. Don't say no and think that I have to remove myself because somebody else will say yes. But say yes and allow God to work in and through you, knowing that he has created you perfectly for the moments that you find yourself in. He's equipped you with everything that you need, and that your authenticity, the realness of who you are, the true identity that you have, and everything that he's called and created you to be is absolutely perfect for the places that you find yourself in and for the people that you walk with.
Brilliant. So our next point is pretty straightforward. It's to be clear. Use language that people can understand. Do you want to hear a good example of a question that you probably shouldn't ask in evangelism? So I was speaking to someone a while ago, and years ago this was, someone had asked her the question, will you be at the marriage supper of the Lamb? Right? I mean, theologically, it's a fair enough question theologically. Maybe frame it in a slightly different way to someone who's maybe not from a church background. But it's actually one of the hardest things to do to learn how to communicate our own story in a way that someone can actually understand what we mean and what we're saying. I think C.S. Lewis says it best. He said, "Our business as Christians is to present that which is timeless, the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, in the particular language of our own age. We must learn the language of our audience. I have come to the conviction that if you cannot translate your thoughts into uneducated language, then your thoughts were confused. Power to translate is the test of having really understood one's own meaning." So in the sense that people aren't educated in church lingo, if we're not actually able to understand it enough in order that we can communicate it in a way that people can actually understand from any background, then we need to do a bit of work on that. It's like whenever Paul says, "To the Jew I became a Jew to win the Jews, to the Gentile I became a Gentile." That's cultural practices, absolutely, but surely that would also be the kind of words he was using, like the kind of language he was using, the imagery he was using, the illustrations. So be clear, avoid any Christian jargon.
Thanks. Number 4 is be a good listener. I think very often when we think about communicating our stories or communicating the gospel, we're thinking about what we have to say and what we need to get out. But actually, being a good listener speaks volumes to people. Because very often when we're in conversation, our minds automatically jump to what it is that you're going to say next. Isn't that right? But to actually stop and pause and really intently listen to people communicates to them, 1, that you value them, 2, that you have time for them, and that they really matter. And to be a good listener means that you have to make time for people. We are busy and we all live busy lives, but there's something about being intentional and wanting to carve out some space to have these one-to-one conversations with people. To be able to make the time to have a coffee, like not just to meet somebody that you haven't seen for ages and be like, "It was really good, well, let's get a coffee and we'll catch up," and never follow up on it. But actually to be intentional, to say, let's get that coffee, let's have that conversation, to create space in the busyness of your life conveys that that person is worth something and that their story matters. And one-to-one conversations do matter in that way. Carving out this unhurried space is really good. And taking the time to truly listen to other people's stories helps us in how we communicate our story. Firstly, we're showing, as I said, that their story matters. But secondly, what it does is it helps us to communicate the right part of our story to them. I mean, if I come to you and tell you that I had this terrible news from the doctors, I don't want your story about how somebody posted £100 through your door as a financial gift and like how good God is. I want to hear about how God steps into situations where there's sickness, where there's fear, where there's an anxiety about the future. And I think we can share really specifically into people's stories when we really take the time to get to know them, to find out the journey that they're walking, to ask good questions to help to understand why they're maybe communicating what they're communicating, so that we can bring really something very specific into that moment. And I think it's like Tim said earlier, that it's great to be able to know your story from like start to end and have this formulated in a thought process. But it's that process of doing that helps you to be able to identify key moments that you can pluck out and communicate. If you've only got a few minutes to communicate something to people, you're not going to start off, well, in 1977, I was born into a Protestant home in East Belfast, and then start the whole story. Like, that's not what people need in the moment. And what they need is something in your story that's relevant and that can bring them hope, that can empathize with them and that can walk with them in the moments that they find themselves in. Being a good listener also helps us to really understand what makes people tick, because sometimes what they say isn't necessarily what they think or what they feel. A recent example, I recently shared testimony here in church one Sunday morning of a healing that I received, and it was on the live stream and it was recorded, and somebody I know saw it and sent me a message saying, very, very blunt, I'm really, really pleased for you and I'm really glad that you got a healing, but why would God heal you and not intervene in some of the really awful situations in the world? That was it. I'm like, great. Yeah, so how do you answer that question over like a private message on Instagram? That's not an easy thing to do. But we started this conversation backwards and forwardsing, and rather than me just jumping straight in with a question, I started, because I know this person quite well, I started to probe a little bit into why they were asking that question. What was it that really made them tick? And they kept coming back to this thing, oh no, it's just because like I've seen these stories about children who are abused or really awful things that happen, and like why does God not answer their cries? And you didn't even pray for this healing, you didn't even ask God, it wasn't even something that you came to him with, and he healed you anyway. Like, why would God do that? And in the process of unpicking that, it actually turned out that what was really rooted behind it was her own disappointment of how in a broken relationship, a broken marriage, that God hadn't heard the cry that she had to be seen by him. And so my answer in that circumstance was very different to one that I would give about why does God allow suffering. And so it's that conversation, it's that probing in, it's that listening intently, and also asking God for revelation in the midst of it all that helps us to communicate something that will speak specifically into those moments. I love this quote that's on the screen. Listen with curiosity, speak with honesty, act with integrity. The greatest problem with communication is we don't listen to understand, we listen to reply. When we listen with curiosity, we listen for what's behind the words. And I think that just sums up, this is not even a Christian who said this, but it sums up what it means to be able to tell our story in a really authentic way with the people that we do life with.
Brilliant. Our fifth point is simply to be Christ-centered. We can overcomplicate it and have all these kind of things like, as you're having a conversation with someone, all these things can be running through our mind, like a checklist. Okay, I need to do this, need to cover this space, need to do this. Like if someone can leave a conversation with any of us with one thing, in our story, may it be that people leave knowing at the very least that Jesus is a definitive turning point in our life, that Jesus is my hope. Sometimes I think a bit of pride or ego can get in, and maybe sometimes we like talking about ourselves a bit too much. I don't particularly like talking about myself. I don't particularly like sharing my testimony. But if in some way it can like simply put someone's eyes onto considering Christ, then it's worth it. So remember, the end goal of sharing our personal testimony isn't that people would find out about us. The point is that people would have a revelation of Jesus. So if someone can leave your testimony with one thing, may it be that they are in no mistake that we owe everything to Jesus, that he loves us deeply and he's transformed our life, and it's our greatest hope that they would have something of that in their own life as well. Be Christ-centered in the sharing of our own story.
Thank you. And point number 6, our last one, is be invitational. Give people something that comes next. I think at anybody's story, on anybody's journey in faith, there will be a point where they will make a decision. And whether that decision is that they don't want to pursue the conversation any further, whether that decision is that they have weighed up everything and they're saying no, or whether it gets to the point where they decide to put their faith in Jesus, people will make a decision. And you may never be part of that decision. You may never know what that decision looks like. But the reality is a decision will be made. And I think it's really obvious that the obvious invitation that we give people is, are you ready to put your trust in Jesus? I mean, that's what the woman at the well did, isn't it? Like, she was pointing other people towards Jesus. In John 4:29, she says, "Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?" And they came out of the town and they made their way towards him. And then later in verse 39, it says, many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. I think it's really good for Christians to know how to be able to communicate the gospel in a really clear way that they can point others towards Jesus. I think it's a really good thing for Christians to learn and to have the confidence to be able to lead somebody in a prayer of salvation. And I would challenge you that if you don't feel confident in that to put the work into being able to do that. I think it's a really good thing to do. And one of the things that we've brought with us today, and they're down at the back, is a little booklet called The Gospelgram. And it's, in effect, it's the Gospel of John. But at the front of it, we have this pictorial method of being able to communicate the gospel, that you can easily show people these pictures and talk them through what it means to put your faith in Jesus, who God is, what his story looks like, and how you can actually lead somebody to Jesus. So, that's, for me, everybody should know how to do that. But the reality is we don't, and we don't all feel confident to do that. And so not everyone will get to that place in their conversations with people where they feel that they can really open up, share the gospel, and lead somebody to Jesus. And that's okay. I used to beat myself up over the fact that for so long, I had never led anybody to Jesus. Never. That I shied out of conversations, that I backed out in places when I know that I should have said something different. But I think what we have to remember is that salvation is not our job. It is the work of the Holy Spirit. Our job is to show up and to live out lives that are gospel-centered, Christ-centered, and to do everything that we can to be able to communicate our faith in a way that is real and true and honest and authentic. And we can get to the point where we share our faith with them in a really true way and a really dynamic way, and we can give them that opportunity. But even if we don't, God will move and work regardless. But this is where also other forms of evangelism come in. I know that most people would say that evangelism done at its best is done one-to-one in relationships. And most of you, whenever you think back to your story, will think of moments of where one-to-one conversations with a Christian have been really formational in your journey of faith and brought you to a place of where you made that decision. But sometimes it's an invitation. It's an invitation to an event. It's an invitation to something else that somebody else is doing within their gifting. Sometimes our relationship will only take it so far, and then there's the opportunity to say, come with me too, and allow somebody else to make that appeal or to give the invitation in a different way. Maybe it's introducing them to a friend or bringing them along to church or bringing them into a conversation with other people that will help to bring them further on their journey. So don't beat yourself up that you have been walking a journey with somebody and you're not seeing what you really hope to see at the end of it. But at the same time, we have to be really intentional about thinking about what opportunities we're going to give them and provide for them to help them to be able to do that. I think that, I was part of a study. I worked on a working group with EA recently, where we did this survey out among evangelicals. It's really trying to figure out, what do people understand by evangelical Christians? That was what was behind it. Survey went out to churchgoers, church attenders, and also out to the public. And for those who answered it from the public, one of the questions that they were asked was about, for those people who do not attend church, would you go if you were invited? And 32% of people said yes. Like, that's high, isn't it? Like, I don't know about you, but like, I would automatically think if I invited somebody to a Christian event, they'd probably say no. And what happens is very often I say no for them, and so the invitation never actually gets out of my mouth because I've already played this whole conversation out in my head. If I invited them, they'd probably say no, so therefore there's no point in me inviting them because I don't want to lose face with them, and yeah, I'll just pray that God will sort it all out some other way. When actually 32% of people who do not attend church in Northern Ireland who were surveyed said that they would go if somebody invited them. And out of those 32% of people who said that they would go, 18% said that they would actually go to a church service, 17% said that they would go to a Christian event, and 9% said that they would accept pastoral help. And like, from our experience of being out in the streets and chatting to people who don't go to church, there is a definite inherent belief in the people in this island of Ireland in God. People believe in God, people believe in Jesus, but they just don't really get church the same. And so actually there is a hunger out there for people to find out what really matters, to find out what can bring them hope. And so invitation, be invitational. Think about what the next steps are going to be in your conversation. It'll look different for different people, but don't leave it in limbo. Don't leave it in a place where there's nothing for them to move on to. There should always be a next step, whether that's inviting them to something, whether it's another coffee, whether it's another conversation, or whether it's bringing them along to church at some point. There should be a goal in our conversations. And I'm not saying this has to happen the very first time you have a one-to-one conversation. This could happen over a long period of time. That as this conversation and as you walk with them and as you journey with them, that you discern that this is the right moment. But be intentional about being invitational.
Brilliant. I think that's totally true, that like next steps aren't always big steps. Do you know, so that guy I was chatting with in the karaoke bar, maybe that was like a little nudge forward. But when we're doing these alphas coming up, I feel like I've then got much more of an open door to actually say to him, do you remember that chat we were having? We're having this thing called Alpha where you can ask the deepest questions and see what people have to say. So because of an opportunity to share a glimpse of a story, he might be more likely to consider the next step now, you know what I mean? So we're all just helping people along their initiation into the kingdom. You know, that's how William Abraham described evangelism, initiating people into the kingdom of God. I think it's a beautiful image of like walking alongside people coming to the Father, you know. So we'd love to take some time. If you guys have any brief reflections you would like to share on this topic, or if anyone has any questions, you might not get a coherent answer, but we'd love to hear them.